Thank you. It is a true privilege to be here with you today. There is almost nothing I like better than talking about methodology with a group of engaged people who have questions and passions and curiosity. Literally nothing better, and so thank you for this invitation. It's so nice to reconnect with Claire and with other colleagues I've met in person at conferences or interacted with on Twitter. I do encourage you to Twitter. You're welcome to take pictures of some of my slides, and let's get started with our conversation. I'd like you to take a minute and just look at what you see. This picture was taken by a man named Tim. It's not his real name, but a man named Tim who was around mid-40s and had a moderate form of myotonic muscular dystrophy. In my doctoral research, I was interested in exploring what is the patient's experience, not only of chronic disease, but of their care. And is the care that we're providing for them meeting the needs? And this sprang up because my research advisor is a neurologist. And as we were brainstorming, what are we interested in? What should we talk about? What do we want to look at? I knew I wanted to bring the patient voice in, and she said, well, I have a question that I'm wondering if we might find a way to explore together, and that's what am I doing for these individuals? Myotonic muscular dystrophy is inherited, it's progressive, and there's really very little to nothing that you can do to stop the progression. There are some symptomatic treatments here and there's some monitoring, but not much that can happen. And so my advisor said, I don't know what I'm doing for them. Can we figure that out? Another challenge with these patients is they can have some mobility issues, but they can also have some profound speech impairments because of the wasting away of their muscles. And in this particular form of muscular dystrophy, there can be significant cognitive impairment. And so I wanted to find a way to engage these participants to hear and understand their stories. Because if you read the academic literature about these patients at the time I did my thesis in 2007-8, a lot of it was these individuals do not have the intellectual capacity to engage in research. They're apathetic about their health. And we really don't have a way to talk to them. And I didn't think that was acceptable. And so I wanted to find a way for them to be able to share their stories. And so I started to engage with visual methodologies. There are a range of those that we'll touch on briefly in my presentation, but the one that I chose is called photo voice, which is rooted in participatory action research and really seeks to find a way to use the visual method to empower people who might be marginalized or have difficulty communicating their experiences. And in that method, you ask participants to use a camera and to take photographs of something representing their experience. And in this case, I asked participants to take a picture of what it means to have myotonic muscular dystrophy. And this was Tim's picture. And as I looked at it with him, I was struck the first thing that struck me was how neat and tidy his apartment was and how it looked like it was kind of decorated for a person much older than him. And so we spent some time chatting about how he really likes to keep his apartment neat, but he's having a hard time pushing his vacuum cleaner, and he's tired and fatigued, and he's having a really hard time keeping it all together. And so we chatted about that. And then I had, of course, to talk about the center pivotal point of this picture, and I asked him about his cane. And he said to me, oh, that's my best friend. It's my third leg. I take it everywhere. It's great. It's what keeps me active. And this made me pause, because only 15 minutes before, I had met Tim at the elevator in the hospital and walked with him down what seemed to be a seemingly endless hallway, as he, rather than using his cane, had his hand on the wall as he gingerly tried to make his way down the hall, and I was trying to consciously slow my steps to meet his. And so I said to him, well, Tim, I don't understand. You said that this cane is your best friend. It's your third leg, but I noticed you didn't bring it with you today. And immediately said, oh no, I don't bring it in public because it makes me look old. It makes me look handicapped, and I'm afraid if somebody sees me with it, they're going to think I'm weak and they might attack me, or I might become a victim of crime. And so Tim's story taught me two things. The first is that visual methods like photo voice or photo elicitation or rich pictures, which we'll talk about a little later, can be really powerful ways to gain access to participants' lived experiences. But Tim also taught me that every way of seeing is a way of not seeing. And had I not had the photograph of Tim's cane, I wouldn't have even known that he had a mobility device. And it's really unlikely that we would have been able to generate the rich, deep conversation about his fears, his self-esteem, and the near exhaustive efforts he went to avoid feeling stigmatized. As we go through our day today, we need to keep in mind that methodologies only give us a snapshot of our participants' experiences, and that we always need to remember that there are many things that remain hidden. But just because we can't see an experience doesn't mean it's not there. And so even if we can only catch a glimpse or a snapshot of what our participants can share with us, we need to use methodologies as a light to try to get at that glimpse. What I'm interested in getting a glimpse of are the things in medical education that we take for granted. For example, that we know what it means to advocate for a patient, that advocacy means the same thing to a patient as it does to a physician, and that anyone can advocate and that anyone can teach someone how to advocate. Coaching, in Canada at least, everyone is being encouraged to become a coach. Well, what does that mean? Are we coaching the same way we coach football or hockey in medicine? And what are the drawbacks of bringing in language from another setting into our culture? I'm also interested in understanding the perspectives of the people in our field that might be beneath the surface, that we might take for granted or that might be hidden. For instance, some of the questions I ask are about residents' experiences of learning and the process of becoming a physician. I've touched on the fact that I'm interested in understanding patients' experiences of care, so we might be able to teach junior doctors and consultants better ways to provide it. And I'm also interested in exploring physicians' experiences of things like underperformance, struggle, imposter syndrome, self-doubt, and how they take these experiences and rebound or develop resilience from them. As we go to, the questions I ask naturally align with a qualitative perspective, which is what I'm going to focus on. But as we go through the day, I'd like you to think about the things that matter to you, the things that you want to spotlight. Because methodology does not drive our research. Our research questions drive methodology, which focuses the questions we want to ask. And that's a myth I often have to challenge my students to think past. Many of them come to me saying, I want to do a qualitative project, or I want to do a survey, in which I send them to someone else because I'm not helpful in that regard at all. And I know we need to think about this differently. What do you care about? What is your question? And once we know your question, let's figure out a way to find the answers to it. And so we need to think about that methodology matters because it's the lens we use to see our questions. This diagram terrified me when I was in my first graduate school seminar. So if this is scary to anyone else, you're not alone. Scientists love big words. And essentially, when we think about framing our research question or the things that drive us, we need to think about why we're interested in the things we're interested in, how we want to find out. And the fancy way that scientists talk about that is our ontology and our epistemology. And so it's this idea of, what is knowledge and how can I find it out? And so people on that end of the spectrum believe that there's one truth out there, and that if I do things like control an experiment or measure or send a survey, I can get at understanding that one truth. I'm over here on this spectrum, where I believe that truth is relative. Is there a truth out there? Maybe, but it depends. It's contextualized. It depends on who everyone is as an individual. Your experience, for example, of myotonic dystrophy might change day to day depending on how you feel when you get up in the morning. And so again, it's that idea that every way of seeing is a way of not seeing, because we think about truth and knowledge claims in different ways. Methodology is the way that we find out the stuff that we're interested in. One of my critiques a bit about medical education research is that often people focus on grounded theory, the one in the middle. And I think there's a couple reasons for that. I think it's because it's gained some legitimacy in the literature. Some big names in our field use grounded theory extensively. I think it fits a lot of the questions that medical education researchers ask. Grounded theory is interested in process. It's interested in social interactions, and it's interested in exploring a field where there might not be theories to drive some of the things we're interested in. And since medical education is relatively new, grounded theory makes a lot of sense. It also provides some fairly clear-cut instructions that you can use to guide your research, even though they're not meant to be prescriptive. But grounded theory isn't our only option or our only lens with which to see medical education research. And in order to understand these methodologies, I think it's important to take a step back and talk about the difference between a methodology and a method. And the way that I teach my students about this is to say, think of a cookbook. There are lots of approaches to cooking. There's French cooking, vegan cooking, pastry cooking. I don't cook, so I'm kind of flying on the seat of my pants here. But cookbooks have a philosophy behind them, a way of doing things. That's what a methodology is. It's a framework for guiding the way we're going to do our exploration or create our recipe. And the methodologies I have here are phenomenology, which is the study of lived experience. And another myth I want to dispel is often a student will say, well, I'm interested in studying experience, so I should do phenomenology. And I'll respond by saying all qualitative research studies experience. Each of these methodologies studies experience through a different lens. So phenomenology studies experience through the lens of time. Time flies when you're having fun is a phenomenological idea. Space, feeling really small in front of a big redwood tree. Your lived body, how it feels to actually experience something like being a left-handed surgeon in a right-handed operating room, as one of my students is exploring. And then relationships. Ethnography studies culture. Participatory action research studies experience through the lenses of our participants driving the research. We don't come to them with questions, they come to us with them, and they drive the process. Visual methodologies, as we'll talk about, study experience through the lens of the visual and visual representations of that meaning for participants. Discourse analysis, which I know is being covered in a workshop, looks at the language we use to talk about things. And then narrative studies experience through the way we craft our stories to make sense of them. So qualitative research has a lot of cookbooks out there for us to use. And it's important to remember that it's difficult for even one expert to be able to do all of these well. But I do think it's important to know that they're out there and that we have choices and that our research questions can be answered in a lot of different ways. Methods are the utensils or ingredients we use to make our study recipe. The most common, by far, in qualitative research tends to be the interview, but observation and focus groups and visual methods like rich pictures and photographs that we'll talk about today are also methods that we use within those methodologies. I use a mix of these, so I will often use visual methods, interviews, and grounded theory together, for example, because I'm interested in trying to generate richer data about something, and these methodologies are open to these kind of combinations of methods. So now that we think about how methodologies provide a certain way of seeing, What is it that we see when we're able to dig below and look beneath the surface? And my answer to that is, it depends. We've already discussed that our questions drive our methodology, and that our experience and worldview impact not only the questions we ask, but how we choose to answer them. And we know that every way of seeing is a way of not seeing. And when you read a piece of scholarship or you embark on your own, we also need to be mindful that the methodological choices we make reflect our worldview. So that chart I showed you earlier maps out a continuum of different worldviews. Ideally, a methodology and a method match the questions, but the choices we make reflect who we are as researchers. And we need to be mindful that these choices can create blind spots. So looking at something through the lens of culture might mean that we don't pay as much attention to relationships, for example, or process. Or that the way I see the world is going to be different than the way you see the world. And so that we could have the exact same participants in the exact same data set and come up with different things. And so we need to be mindful of that, not only when we're doing our own work, but reading the work of others. And that's where reflexivity comes in. And what reflexivity is the understanding of the importance of one's values and attitudes within the process. It's about taking a critical look inward and exploring your own reality and experiences, and how social, economic, and political contexts might influence not only what you're asking, but what your participants are telling you. This is a key feature of methodological integrity and rigor in qualitative research. And unfortunately, for a variety of reasons, it tends to get short shrift. I think partly because we don't always learn how to do it well, and it becomes a bit of an afterthought. And also our publications don't always permit us room to go into a deep dive. But if this is a new concept for you, I wanted to walk you through a little bit of my reflexivity and the things that I talk about with my peers as we debrief about our research, or that I think about as I say, why am I so interested in this? Is it because of this part of my life? And so I'll start by sharing a little bit of my reflexive story. I live in Canada now, but I'm actually from Rochester, New York, which is not New York City. I'm about 7 hours away. I didn't actually visit New York till I was around 21. I can tell you, I don't know if anyone's ever been to Rochester, it does not look that glamorous. So just putting that out there. But Rochester used to be a hotbed of social justice. And we just had our midterm elections last week. And the reason I'm able to vote is because of women like Susan B. Anthony, who was arrested for trying to cast a vote as a woman. She was also close friends and partners with Frederick Douglass, who was a former slave who became a major figure in the abolitionist movement. And so they both settled in Rochester, and in the 19th century, Rochester was the place for women's rights, African American rights. The first Women's Rights Convention was held just down the road. And part of me wonders if that drives my interest in advocacy. These images were all around me. Statues of Susan B. Anthony and Frederick Douglass are everywhere. There's schools named after them, there's parks, and I'm from Rochester, and have you heard of Susan B. Anthony? Because that's, that's how I connect that. And so I think about that, and I think about them and that pride and that culture that I grew up in. And it's almost unmistakable upon reflection that it is probably why I'm drawn to these issues. Rochester is also the international headquarters for Eastman Kodak. And while Eastman Kodak is not doing very well right now because they never caught up to the fact that they were a company of making memories, not film, it was the world's image center at one time. With George Eastman developing and patenting his Kodak camera, it used to be one of the massive employers in Rochester before it went bankrupt. I had family members in it. And again, it's just identity of where you're from and the things that you see and don't even pay attention to that likely drive why I'm interested in the visual. I never thought I would be a PhD researcher, ever. When I went to university, I thought I was going to be a public relations person for a nonprofit health organization. That was my dream. I studied health communication in university. But I graduated just as 9/11 happened and the economy crashed. And the first jobs that went were those like public relations and nonprofit organizations. So I needed a plan B. And what I ended up getting was a research assistant job working on clinical trials looking at depression and Parkinson's disease. And I fell in love with research. And I became closely involved with not only the Parkinson's patients, but also the Huntington's Disease Society of America. I did an internship with them. I was a support group facilitator with them. And I was also on their board of directors at our local chapter. I did fundraising, patient advocacy. And so I learned firsthand, I was able to see the work that physicians did getting these drugs to market and caring for patients in the clinic. And I also got to see the patient and caregiver side about what it was like and what it took to live everyday life with these conditions. And that drove my interest in trying to get patients' stories out in the literature. I don't know if this translates, but I'm also a huge Buffalo Bills fan. I think they played here 2 years ago and probably lost. But this likely helps me, helps explain my interest in studying underperformance and failure, because if you recall, they are the team that has lost 4 Super Bowls in a row. But they made it there 4 years in a row. And that shows that underperformance and failure, but also that bounce back or resilience that I'm also interested in studying. And finally, I'm a mom. So I have 2 little girls. I had 2 healthy pregnancies, but I'm also a patient, and my children are patients, so I'm also a caregiver. My girls influence everything that I do, the way that I'm able to be professional and to travel and to do all of these things. And so when I think about my research, I think about, well, what would I do if I were the caregiver in that chair? Or what would I do if I were the patient in that chair? And so this is what reflexivity looks like, and how we can build it into how we look at our own data and questions. And when we think about both the researcher's worldview and the lens we use with which to explore in our inquiries, when we combine those and we start to generate our data and look at it, methodology can become a prism. So not just a lens, but an actual prism that can refract assumptions. It can also become a way to transform, a prism through which to see different ways of understanding. As we saw with Tim's example and story, I'm so drawn to visual images because of their ability to evoke visceral and emotional responses in ways that are memorable, coupled with their capacity to help us empathize or see another's point of view, and to provoke new ways of looking at things critically. They're powerful tools for researchers to use in different ways during various phases of research. Visuals have helped me transform my understanding of experience. Just looking at Tim's example, I was able to see what people share with the world and what they will only share with maybe one researcher or one small pocket, or the parts that they keep outside of the everyday experience. And I'd like to share with you a few more examples of my work with visuals. The power for me of visuals is that they do 3 main things. The first thing that visuals are able to help us do is untangle complexity. This study is one that was led by one of our junior doctors, who's an obstetrics and gynecology resident. And she came with a question saying, my colleagues and I are struggling because we don't know how to navigate our multiple roles. You know, we're told that we're learners and service providers, but there's a real tension there. And I want to figure out a way that we can unpack this. And so what my co-supervisors and I suggested to her was, what if we tried rich pictures? Which is basically, we asked during an academic half day, her and her colleagues to sit and just draw a picture. Show us your multiple roles and how you navigate them. And what we learned was striking. So the literature talks about, in various ways, 2 main ones: learner service provider. But what our participants told us is, well, they're there, sure, but I'm also supposed to be a teacher. I'm also a mom. I'm also a spouse. I'm also supposed to be well-balanced and finding some work-life balance and finding a role in health and wellness. And these tensions were making it very difficult for residents to be able to be well and to feel like they were learning. What they felt like was they were spinning their wheels and learning by trial and error. So I'm supposed to be a scholar, I'm supposed to be a teacher, but one, nobody's showing me how to do that or giving me any feedback on if I'm doing it well. And it's not the priority. My priority has to be patient care. So yes, I know I'm supposed to be a learner and I'm supposed to be studying for my exams, but I'm too tired. One person drew a picture of the clock and said, I only know what time it is because I haven't actually been outside to see if it's night or day. And so when that says 6 o'clock, I have no idea if that's 6 a.m. or 6 p.m. And so it was this experience of what that's like to navigate those tensions. Visual methods can also help us reveal hidden perspectives. So I've shared my story with you, and I shared Tim's story about my drive to really bring the patient experience into medical education. My background in PhD isn't in medical education. It was actually in health services, health and rehabilitation sciences. And I did my postdoc in medical education. When I got to start meeting with my supervisors, I was like, we're teaching learners to be patient-centered, but where's the patient in how we teach and assess that? And I'm really struck that they're largely absent. There are one-off opportunities, often they're storytellers. I work with the storytellers at our hospital back in Ottawa, developing ways for them to be able to present their stories to groups. We, of course, work with standardized patients. But patients are most likely to be engaged in teaching when that's not their intention. It's when they're in the clinic, there to receive care. And so there's this tension of, well, what are we doing? You know, we're using them almost as objects of learning, but are we doing it thoughtfully? And do they get to have any say in how students are performing? And so that's what I'm interested in studying. And one of the routes that I'm doing that with first is the health advocate competency, which in Canada we have what's called the CanMeds roles, of which health advocacy is one. The others are communicator and manager and medical expert. The health advocacy one often becomes the one we laugh at. It's kind of a joke. Oh yes, the health advocacy competency. But I learned in my thesis that for patients like Tim, who may have a progressive incurable disease, advocacy is care. It's what they need. And so I really wanted to dig into both patients' and physicians' perspectives about this term that is often ill-defined. And so I asked them to take pictures of what advocacy means. And these are a couple of those snapshots. The first in the corner with the watch was taken by a physician, but I heard from both patients and physicians that advocating is hard, it's time-intensive, and it's really risky, because it means that something's not working and you're in charge of fixing it, and it's usually the squeaky wheel that wins. And so by being an advocate, you often risk for patients being considered difficult and for providers being shut out or shunned in some way. One of our participants who's a physician said that, you know, he's been sanctioned essentially by the university for commenting. Patients and physicians also defined advocacy a bit differently. Some of it was similar, so filling out forms, trying to bump up appointments, resources. This particular patient brought all her research that she does, and again talked about the tension of taking her research folder in and questioning her doctor and being perceived as difficult. But patients also saw advocacy as more. They saw it as a progressive thing, as in terms of self-care, taking care of myself, exercising, meditating, nutrition, things that physicians hadn't even considered. And if we have this different perception of some of the forms of advocacy, when we're advocating in the clinic, are we really being patient-centered? And finally, visual methods provide a new way of seeing. And I want to focus on this particular study for a moment. This is one participant's view of the antenatal inpatient unit. The antenatal inpatient unit at our hospital is a 20-bed unit in which women can be admitted for 2 days up to several months for complications of pregnancy that are either life-threatening to mom or baby. And I was interested in this unit for a couple of reasons. The first is I work with a lot of obstetrics and gynecologists. The second is that I had a friend who was an inpatient on the unit for 6 months. And I would go to visit her and I was struck by how the women on the unit had developed their own language. They called themselves the bleeders or the leakers, and they were really trying to figure out where they stood and what was, and trying to find a place, a home on this unit. And it also seemed like a really great place to study patient-centered care. These women are there sometimes for months. They have the opportunity to interact with different healthcare providers, nurses, dietitians, social workers, residents, consultants. And what does patient-centered care look like, and how does it unfold? And so we asked women to take pictures of their experience of patient-centeredness on the unit. And what women told us was that they struggled with the loss of control and grieved not having a normal pregnancy. They identified key time periods in their care that were tense and that really made them lose control, like when they were first admitted, because it was often done abruptly. They started to bleed and were immediately flown in without any of their possessions, without anything, leaving their families hours away. And what women wanted trainees to understand was that, just trying to get, was that the things that we do every day with patients makes a difference. So if we communicate too much with jargon, if we don't have continuity of care because somebody's on call at different times and all of a sudden the plan changes, the fact that rounds are at 6 a.m. when I'm sleeping in my bed and I don't feel like I can take a shower because somebody could come in at any moment. And the really interesting thing was that physicians knew all of these issues were problematic for the women. This loss of control, this loss of sense of privacy. Rounding at 6 a.m. is disempowering when women are lying in bed, haven't showered, they're barely awake, and they're trying to take in information. But what we were told is, we get those are problems, but I don't think we can fix it because it's just the way we do things. And so it's about unpacking that and seeing that, well, why? Why can't we round at different times? What is it about our structural forces that make it so that this gold standard of patient-centeredness isn't possible? And the other thing that we learned from women is that their experience in the antenatal unit was challenging because for the most part, they felt healthy. They didn't feel sick. Sure, they were scared and they were anxious, but for the most part, they felt fine. And they were just waiting there in the off chance that something catastrophic would happen in the moment. And so they're anxious and they're scared and they miss their families. And the thing that struck them the most is that they stopped being people to the healthcare providers. And so when I asked about the experience of patient-centeredness, this one woman who'd been on the unit for several months took this picture and she said, "This is my room." She said, "Notice the cards on the windowsill and notice I've put out a little polka dot tablecloth and I've put some flowers up because I thought if I made my room look like a young woman's room, they might not see me as a patient anymore." And so she said, and I quote, "It brought the doctors. They saw me more of a person than a patient, I think. They could see that I'd been there for a long time and I had a lot of support from home. It just made me unique, I think, a little bit, and stand out. And they would open up and tell me about their stories and their kids and their lives." Like Tim, this woman had to go out of her way to try to project herself as the identity she wanted to be seen. She went to great efforts and lengths to be seen as a person by her physicians. And I showed this to some of my obstetrics and gynecology colleagues, and they were taken aback. And I think we need to remember this when we're busy in our hectic lives, that these are also people. And that bringing this experience into the unit, they might provide a way to be able to talk to residents about communication skills and the way we talk about patient-centeredness. We are a room full of curious people. We're all here because we wanted to develop methodological expertise to shed light on the questions in medical education that we care about. I recognize that through my talk today, I may have raised more questions than I've answered, and that's okay. But I challenge you, as we leave today and learn together today, to wrestle with the hard questions, to engage in the hard work of reflexivity, to think carefully about the methodological choices you make and the reasons why you make them, and to reach out if there's an expert in the field who can help you with a methodological choice to help you answer your questions. I look forward to learning with you today. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much. What reflexivity in action, that was my particular highlight. I'm sure we've got loads of questions, so I'm going to invite them from the audience. I am the roving mic. Susan.
Thanks very much for your talk. It was really interesting. Can I ask you how people react when you ask them to draw a picture, and if they're uncertain, how you actually get them to do it?
Yes, so one of the challenges of visual methods is often buy-in. And so we'll often say, okay, well, I'd like you to take pictures or draw a picture, and their first response, why, right? And so I explain it to them about some of the benefits of visual methods. And I will often walk through it with them. So we actually got orthopedic surgeons to draw pictures, really detailed and elaborate pictures, and we were shocked. I've only ever had one person refuse to draw. And I think it just becomes this idea, well, this is kind of odd, but sure, I'll give it a try. And so I leave them to draw, and then often the feedback I get is, this was really helpful. I often don't have time in my everyday life just to pause and sit and reflect about this situation. And so it's about bringing that in and that buy-in and saying, I get that it's challenging and it feels strange. It felt that way for me too when I tried it. Could we please just do it for 5 minutes, and if it's not working, we'll move on and just do an interview. And I've only had one person say, I don't want to do this.
I loved your metaphor of methodology as the cookbooks and methods are the recipes. So I am a cook, and I have loads of cookbooks at home. So how do you get around the fact that sometimes you want to cook one thing and sometimes you want to cook another, and sometimes you want to use one cookbook and sometimes you want to use another? How do you, because then it starts to feel a bit positivist, like I only ever use this cookbook.
And that's what I sometimes struggle with too, is this idea of, do we need to be methodologically pure? So I use grounded theory a lot. Do I need to always identify myself as a grounded theorist? And my particular answer is no, I don't. My questions may or may not be a grounded theory question. Maybe my question is a phenomenology cookbook question, and I need to pull that one off the shelf because I'm really interested in understanding somebody's lived experience. For example, when we're talking about the left-handed surgeon in a right-handed operating room, that could very much be a phenomenological question, because it's either, are we looking at the lived body in relationship to that, or are we interested in exploring it from grounded theory with the process of how do you learn to be a surgeon when you're left-handed? Those are two different questions that require different approaches. And so I think it's, what is the question that drives your passion? And let's pull the cookbook off the shelf that can answer it.
Thank you. More questions?
Hi, I'm a psychiatry trainee, but also a patient. And so in my job, I'm very comfortable with dealing with emotion and the person, that's my job. But my experience of obs and gynae is that the sort of dehumanizing bit of it is, it feels to me as a patient like a function for the clinicians, because it's like, I don't want to open up the can of worms of your emotion about whatever the problem is. And I've sort of just had to make my peace with that as a patient, thinking this does something for my doctor or nurse, that they need to do this job to see lots of sad ladies all the time in their job. And I wonder if you address that, like what is the underlying function that the dehumanizing serves for the clinician, and if you obliterate it by putting a polka dot tablecloth there, can you replace it with something more healthy for the team?
So there is a lot of research that dehumanizing can be protective against burnout. And so maybe that's what's happening. Maybe that's one of those things that a provider chose not to show me. What I heard from was, we're so busy, we're putting out fires, I have to run to the OR and I have to care for this, and I'm just putting out fires constantly, and so I only have a few minutes to be in this room, and then I've got to delegate to someone else. We heard that in our advocacy research as well, that advocacy became that extra thing that I just don't have time to do, and so I'm going to give it to somebody else. I might give it to the patient, I might give it to a social worker, I might give it to a nurse. And I think whether or not it's that protective against burnout and emotional distress, or if it's this perception that the system is designed in such a way that I don't have another choice. I've tended to hear the latter, that this isn't my fault, that they're being dehumanized. It's the system that's creating these tensions for me.
Hi, thank you for your talk. It was just more of a comment. I'm actually an obstetrics and gynecology registrar. And of anyone that was... and also a patient within that environment. So I was interested to kind of just say, really, that if anyone wanted to continue the conversation about that side of things with yourself, then I'd be happy to do that, if that would be interesting to you.
Thank you.
I'm reminded of the thing you said at the beginning, that in research you start with the things you really care about, and it strikes me that there are some things that people are really caring about, that there are resonances, and your advice to kind of start there, then think about your question, and then go the place your question takes you is very pertinent here, because when research is tough, the fact it's something that we care about is the thing that kind of keeps us going. So, lovely illustration of that. Other questions?
Thank you, that was really inspirational. I wanted to ask you, have you ever found that you've opened the box and there's just so much and it's overwhelming? And if so, how do you put a lid on it and extract something that becomes meaningful?
This is a challenge. Now I'm working primarily with consultants and junior doctors and medical students, but when I did my doctoral work, I was working with people with severe neurological illness that in many cases was hereditary and devastating. And it's hard. I would leave interviews completely drained. I remember coming out of one and I couldn't even, I just sat there because it's so heavy. And these people, I think, often are interested in participating in qualitative research because they just want to tell somebody. And they want to tell somebody who is neutral. It's not their partner, it's not their spouse. They don't want to be a burden. And one of the key things for me is that you have protections in place. So with my Huntington's patients, there were some challenges with some psychiatric manifestations that because of their damage to their frontal lobes, they could get violent, there could be issues. And so my advisor said, you're going to conduct these in the hospital where there's services around. And that was really helpful because I did have a challenge with one person. I found that having those protections in place, but also having somebody to debrief with, having a peer, a colleague to say, this was really rough, could we talk it out? Did I handle it okay? Do I need to go with other resources? Because I'm not a trained therapist. I'm not trained to be able to put people back together if they share something that makes them fall apart. Same with me, right? And so it's about having those resources, and it can be very difficult. And to answer your other question, in that one instance with the patient with Huntington's disease, we had a conversation about this got pretty heavy. What can I use and what I can't use? And I make it very clear to my participants with the photos and whatever they tell me in an interview, you have every right to tell me, I've shared it here, do not share it elsewhere. And so that's another strategy I use.
I think we've got time for maybe two more questions.
Hi. Is it working? Okay. Looking back at your own journey in educational research, what advice would you give to students who are quite new like us at this field?
Yeah, so I work with students in this field all the time, primarily junior doctors and medical students. And again, I start with, what is your passion? What are you interested in? And let's go from there. And then it's about trying to find people credible resources, because unfortunately methodologies can be taken up in ways that weren't maybe how they were intended by the original author. And so it's about pointing them to the right sources. Go to the original source book. If you want to do constructivist grounded theory, read Charmez. If you want to do phenomenology, read Van Manen. and really get a sense of that. And then let's see, if I'm not an expert in that, let's see if we can find somebody who is. So I'm quite comfortable helping people with visual methods and grounded theory. I've never done narrative, but I have a PhD colleague who has. And so maybe she could join our committee and we can work together. And I think it's about providing a space so that you feel comfortable asking questions, that you feel comfortable saying, this is really hard, and I don't know if I want to do this anymore because I've been there. And so it's making and creating that open space to be able to say, if you don't feel comfortable talking to me, let's find someone you can talk to because this journey is tough. It's unquestionably rewarding, but it's tough. And to really prepare students that with qualitative especially, you're not just reading interviews once, you're not just coding once, it's this long process. Writing manuscripts and editing and revising them is the same, and I think it's about being prepared for that and knowing that it's going to be frustrating, it's going to be tedious, but there's joy in it too, and let's work it out together. So I would encourage you, read original source books, be prepared that this is hard and frustrating, and to try to pinpoint somebody that you can debrief with.
Thank you. One last one, or are we all good? We've all got so much to think about now. So at the beginning I said I met Kori and I was just wowed by her values and her approach to the world. You will also know that I'm wowed by her methodological expertise and the way that she works with such complex but really important issues. So it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for travelling across the pond. Thank you.